Zeno, son of Nasius, was a native of Citium in Cyprus, a Greek city that had received Phoenician settlers. He had a neck that bent to one side, and Apollonius of Tyre says that he was lean, longish, and swarthy. Hence, someone called him an Egyptian vine. He was thick-legged, flabby, and weak. This is why, as Perseus says, he declined most dinner invitations. He delighted, they say, in green figs and sunbathing. Welcome once again to Young Heretics, where today we are talking about Stoicism. I've had a bunch of requests to do Stoicism, and I wanted to wait until I had the time and the space to do Stoicism right, and probably to do a lot of ancient Greek philosophy. Because one of the things with the Stoics, who are these Greek philosophers that kind of come about in the Hellenistic era after the death of Alexander the Great, is that they have this reputation in modernity, and people are actually getting into Stoicism as a life philosophy, as a sort of a self-help course. There are threads about it on Reddit. You can find any number of modern treatments of Stoicism of people who are actually trying to be Stoics. Plus, it's a word in English, right? It means something. It means to be kind of detached from your emotions or in control of them. Super laconic is another word that people use sometimes, just like very spare and self-controlled. In order to get down to Stoicism itself, we're going to have to go back into the world of Hellenistic philosophy, which is this enormous subject. So we're going to take a bunch of episodes to do it. And we're going to start with Stoicism. We're going to talk about the Greek Stoics, then the Epicureans, who were around about the same time. And then we'll talk about Stoicism in Rome, which is kind of maybe closest to the like self-help version that we're seeing today. And then finally, we'll talk about how Christianity kind of crashed into the middle of this big sea of all these different schools. So before I jump in, I'm just going to remind you about the announcement that I made last week. A lot of you guys have been asking, how to support this show, how to help out with it. And there's a really concrete way that you can do that and also become a sort of VIP member of the Young Heretics community. So if you go to youngheretics.com/locals, you'll find this whole new world of Young Heretics stuff. So Locals is a platform that is designed to promote free speech and to fight back against big tech. I'm really excited to be on there, and you can get a bunch of stuff on there. You get, first of all, next week's episode. You'll get it in advance without ads, and you can get all sorts of like extras from me that you wouldn't get anywhere else. So articles and live streams, Q&As. Then you can also be on the video mailbag, which is cool because I can see your lovely face as I talk to you and answer your questions. youngheretics.com/locals. Head over there to sign up and become a VIP member of the community, and leave a little message once you're there to let me know, so that I can, make sure to answer as many of you as I can. Just come and say hi. So the passage I read at the beginning is from the Lives of the Eminent Philosophers by Diogenes Laertes. It's this big compendium of all these Greek philosophers and their attitudes to things and how they live their lives. And it's his opening. At the beginning of book 7, Diogenes talks about Zeno of Citium, who's the scholarch, the founder of the Stoic school in Greece, lives from 335 BC up to 263 BC. The reason that I start with him, and the reason I read that kind of weird passage about how he's kind of weak and flabby, and is because I don't want us to approach Stoicism like it's just this kind of abstract set of ideas. This is a real philosophy in the ancient world, and philosophy today, if it's practiced rightly, is not just kind of like this weird academic thing that people go off and do. And it's really easy when you start talking about Stoicism. We're going to talk about some really trippy cosmological stuff today. It's really easy to start thinking about this the way that academics think about philosophy, which is like, what are the propositions that I can make and the syllogisms that I can write? And this, is a part of philosophy. But Diogenes and I think Zeno and the Stoics themselves think of philosophy as a way of life that is an entire integrated system of looking at everything, how to live in the world, how to think about the parts of the world that are beyond our experience, how to think about death, how to think about whether there's life after death, like all of this stuff, and then with concrete implications about how to live. And so the reason why a guy like Diogenes Laertes, who, by the way, we don't really know when he lived, probably quite a bit later than the philosophers he writes about, like 3rd century AD or so. The reason why Diogenes tells these stories about these people with particular characteristics who lived at particular times and doesn't just sort of recite their ideas is because for the Greeks, especially for those Greeks who lived in the wake of kind of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates before them, for the Greeks it was a matter of intense kind of like real life importance to get these things right and to discuss them and to argue back and forth about them. Back when we talked about Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which is a work that is obviously very sort of can be very obscure and difficult to understand. I was emphasizing that this is a work about like you. What do you do tomorrow? How do you live when you wake up? And how do you think about yourself? And how do you be the best you that you can be? And I want to keep that thread up because this is a show about making clear to you that the West belongs to you. And these sort of philosophical systems that have become big names, Stoicism, like I said, we'll talk about Epicureanism, they have this mystique about them, but what they really are is ways of life that actual people practiced and lived. So just to sort of situate us in time, right? We've taken this show from really the beginning of Western philosophy, which is Socrates' kind of engagement with the sophists and his wandering about in Athens, kind of enticing young men to speculate on the deeper meaning of things and go beyond just their day-to-day lives, right? After that, after Socrates is killed by the Athenian state for posing a danger essentially to society, right? He didn't believe in the gods the city believed in, and he was corrupting the youth because he was just like too his ideas were too far outside of the sort of standard practices of Athenian society. And we've talked about there are some ways in which this was true and that Socrates really did kind of unsettle the Athenian aristocracy. In 399, he's condemned to death, which is this enormous tragedy, especially in the life of Plato, who's Socrates' best student. So Plato, in his academy, which is a school just outside the city walls of Athens in this sort of sacred olive grove, he tries to take Socrates' legacy forward and to capture in these dialogues what it was to know this man and then to kind of go beyond Socrates' own inquiries into truth, how we should live. Plato is followed by Aristotle, right, who founds the Lyceum. And that's kind of as far as we've gotten. We've talked about all those guys. And now we're entering a kind of a new phase of Greek philosophy. It's called the Hellenistic era. It's defined by the death of Alexander, or rather it begins in 323. Alexander dies, and politically, what happens is very similar to what then happens philosophically, which is you had this one guy, Alexander, who had sort of made these incredible titanic efforts to unify the whole Mediterranean and the whole world. And then in his wake, nobody can really hold on to that dynamic sort of central power that he was going for. And so all of this empire kind of fragments and splits into these many little kingdoms. Alexander is to politics kind of what Socrates is to philosophy, and Plato and then Aristotle a little bit after them, that they are these kind of hugely central dynamic figures. And after them, things start to fragment and fall apart. And the Hellenistic era is this sort of explosion of different ways to take Socrates' work forward. These are competing life philosophies, competing ways of looking at the world, of acting in Athenian society and Mediterranean culture more generally. And Stoicism is one of the ones that really kind of caught on, especially in Rome. It was especially appealing to Romans for reasons we'll get into in a second. But that's the lay of the land, right? We're looking at the development of these many schools and how they were finally kind of shaken up after the death of Christ and in some ways eventually sort of swept away by Christianity. Before we go any further, let me bring you a word from a new sponsor. I'm very grateful to be sponsored by these guys. If you follow me on Twitter, you know that I think a lot about my beard. I think I have a pretty good one, I get actually a lot of questions about, well, how do you grow your beard? How do you trim it? How do you take care of it? And it takes a lot of work. Let me tell you, it is not just something that like naturally happens. But I have these friends at the Mini Mustachery, it's called, and they sell a bunch of different products. They are not just one-trick ponies. They have this kind of vast array of stuff. Beard wax. I use their beard wax all the time. Like you just kind of straighten out the hairs and make them able to be combed. But also straight razors. I love shaving with a straight razor. I use a straight razor from Mini Mustachery. What you do is you go to minimustachery.com, MINIMUSTACHERY.com/heretics, HERETICS, and then you'll get 20% off. So minimustachery.com/heretics for all kinds of shaving and beard products. Go to minimustachery.com/heretics and use the promo code heretics, HERETICS, just like in the title. Okay, back to the show. So in keeping with this theme of philosophy as real life, right? Philosophy not as something that you go off and kind of think about in one corner and then forget when you go out to the store to buy eggs, right? But something that actually is accountable to making your life better and to making your vision of the world more sane, right? Imagine that. I want to read a really nice passage from an entry about Stoicism in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Now, just a note about that encyclopedia, it's fully online, and because things like Wikipedia that are fully online can be a little dicey, I think people don't necessarily immediately trust every resource, rightly don't trust every resource they find online, but the Stanford Encyclopedia is great. It has, actual scholars, experts in their field writing about these philosophical systems, and the one on Stoicism and I'm going to read from now is by a guy called Dirk Boltzli. He's at the University of Tasmania. And here's what he says. He says, when considering the doctrines of the Stoics, it is important to remember that they think of philosophy not as an interesting pastime or even a particular body of knowledge, but as a way of life. They define philosophy as a kind of practice or exercise. Ascesis is the Greek word here, in the expertise concerning what is beneficial. Once we come to know what we and the world around us are really like, and especially the nature of value, we will be utterly transformed. This therapeutic aspect is common to their main competitors, the Epicureans, and perhaps helps to explain why they were both eventually eclipsed by Christianity. And that's a pretty nice summary of where we're going to be going in these next few episodes, right? But there's something really important here that I want to stress, which is, I've done all of these episodes now about how to deal with our present crisis. And one of the things I keep emphasizing is that if you are thinking in terms of these big, lofty abstractions, and you're not emotionally and intellectually connecting to what's immediately around you, to your surroundings, then you are likely to go astray. Because the way that we sharpen our ideas and the way that we test them against reality is by putting them into practice and by looking around us. The one reason why academic philosophy can be so maddening is because they'll say things that in practice they would never do. So you'll have a philosopher who tells you, well, there's no such thing as truth or stable reality. And then they are perfectly happy to put a cup of coffee on a table behind them, right? Because they know that the table's there. They're not saying, actually the table's not really there. If you don't connect your philosophy to real life, and if you don't ground your attitudes in real life, then you end up with stuff that you just know isn't true because it doesn't actually correlate to anything in reality. The same thing is true about right now, right? Your question is, how do I live? How do I live best? And so the reason why I'm choosing this moment to really kind of take a tour through Hellenistic Greek philosophy and through the aftermath of it is because I want to give you some of the best possible answers that people have had. I'm ultimately going to reject both Stoicism and Epicureanism, but I want to take them extremely seriously as systems of looking at the world that were perfectly reasonable on the basis of what people could see at the time and knew at the time, because these are hugely sophisticated systems. I say all of this to you before noting that, in fact, we don't have any complete works by Greek Stoics. The Roman Stoics, the Romans who adopted Stoicism or used it as part of their ethical philosophy, we have lots from them. But we mostly are gleaning what we know about Stoicism from people like Diogenes Laertes, people who compiled a bunch of different books and texts and sort of worked from them. I am mostly going to be reading from the Lives of the Eminent Philosophers today. There are others, and I'm going to read just Baltzi's sort of summary of this. He says, "We do not possess a single complete work by any of the first three heads of the Stoic school. The founder, Zeno of Citium," this is the weak guy who liked figs and didn't go to parties, the founder, Zeno of Citium, Cleanthes, or Chrysippus. Chrysippus was particularly prolific, composing over 165 works, but we have only fragments of his works. The only complete works by Stoic philosophers that we possess are those by writers of imperial times, Seneca, Epictetus, and the emperor Marcus Aurelius. And we're going to talk about those in a later episode. Those works are primarily focused on ethics. So what we have instead are the philosophers' opinions on nature by Pseudo-Plutarch, Diogenes Laertes' Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, and Stobaeus excerpts, as well as sources in Aetius and Arius Didymus. So we are looking here at a very delicate game of picking apart these sources that tell us about the early Stoics, but often much later, sometimes in a manifestly hostile way. Laertes, one of the reasons why Laertes is good is he's not that hostile. Diogenes seems to be willing to actually engage the Stoics on their own terms. But Plutarch, for example, is hostile. The later Christian writers are openly trying to dismantle Stoicism and drive it off the world stage. But for our purposes, let's take a sort of bird's eye view and figure out what this holistic system is. It's got three parts: physics, ethics, and logic. So I'm going to start with this and with Diogenes' summary of how this works, because he talks about how they're kind of all coherent and fit together in one. So the Stoics say that philosophical doctrine has three parts: the physical, the ethical, and the logical. Zeno of Citium was the first to divide it this way in his work on reason. Chrysippus did the same, as did Apollodorus Ephilus in the first books of his introductions to the Doctrines, Eudromus, and so forth. These parts Apollodorus calls topics, Chrysippus and Eudromus call them species, others call them genera. They compare philosophy to an animal, likening logic to the bones and sinews, ethics to the fleshier parts, and physics to the soul. Or again, they liken it to an egg. The outer parts are logic, the next parts are ethics, and the inmost parts are physics, or to a fertile field, of which logic is the surrounding fence, ethics the fruit, and physics the land or the trees, or to a city that is well fortified and governed according to reason. Now, this holistic integration of all kinds of intellectual activity is something that we tend to have lost in the modern world. And it's something that we should recover, because it's a way of testing your ideas in one area against your ideas in another, right? This idea that it's all part of one body, an organic whole, that, if you have an idea about God, let's say, or an idea about space and time, then you should be able to explain why that idea makes sense in light of how you believe you should behave ethically. This is one of my big complaints, for example, about strict Darwinists, people who believe that all there is in life is this kind of physical development of one thing after the next, is that usually there's some kind of Darwinian explanation of why we behave ethically, like that there's some benefit to monogamy or to not lying and cheating, right? There are these sort of natural advantages. But there's no explanation in that philosophy for why we should behave ethically. If in fact we can get another advantage by doing something else, by murdering somebody, there's no good Darwinist reason. There's no reason in Darwinian cosmology, if you want to call it that, for why you should behave ethically. And that tells you that there's something wrong with that as a complete philosophy. Stoicism and in general Hellenistic philosophy sort of groups all of these things together so that the coherence of them will be an argument in itself for the good of the ideas. So what we're going to do is we are going to proceed through these three parts. We're going to start with logic, which is kind of the bones or the sort of like the operating system would be the metaphor that I would use now, right? Of the way that your computer has this operating system, and then we'll move on to cosmology and finally to ethics, because ethics is the thing I think everybody thinks about when they think about Stoicism, and maybe when people are asking me to talk about Stoicism, they have ethics, Stoic ethics in mind. So we'll save that for last, and we'll show hopefully how it grows like a plant, or again, to use all of these organic metaphors, right? It grows out of these first few ideas. Stoic logic, which includes, not only how we reason about things, but how we know them, right? Which is called epistemology. It's actually one of my favorite parts of Stoicism, even though it's not the part that's like most famous. So I'm going to read actually from Cicero, who's a late Republican Roman, and we've talked about him before. We'll talk about him again. And Cicero himself was not a Stoic. He was what's called an academic skeptic, which is another kind of a branch of after Plato died, a branch of Platonic philosophy. But Cicero has a lot of respect for Stoicism, and he talks about epistemology in a kind of really interesting way. It records this metaphor by Zeno of Citium, who remember is the founder, right? This is from the Academica. That Zeno used to demonstrate it. This is the epistemological, how we know things of Stoicism, right? Zeno used to demonstrate it with a gesture. He would show his hand in front of him with his fingers outstretched and say, an impression is like this. Then, after closing his fingers slightly, he would say, assent is like this. Then, having closed his fingers entirely and made a fist, he would say that this was comprehension, from which likeness he even gave this faculty a name, a Greek name, Catalysis, which it did not previously have. But then, once he had moved his left hand over to enclose that fist tightly and forcefully, he used to say that knowledge, episteme, was of this nature. Now, these are Greek, you see how complicated this stuff gets, right? These are Greek terms that are being translated into Latin by Cicero. But the basic for 4 stages of how we know things in Stoicism are as follows. The impression, which is just the open hand, right? That's just the sense perceptions that you have and the way that they strike you. So right now, I'm looking into a camera, I see a black circle, and that black circle is an impression. I don't have to do anything for it to happen to me. It just happens when my eyes are open. Assent is the next step. When I see that black circle, it gives me certain ideas about reality, like that there is a camera in front of me, right? I might just say, oh, I have the experience of seeing a black circle. But what I actually say is, oh, I'm seeing a camera lens. And giving assent to that is where I say, like, yes, there is a camera in front of me because my senses tell me that. Again, very sort of intuitive, even though it's kind of granular and weird, right? It makes perfect sense. The next thing, this catalepsis, which is really important. This is actually a crucial part of Stoic epistemology. Catalepsis is what you do when you do assent right. That is when you see something and I am correct that there is a camera in front of me. That's a real thing about the world outside of me that my sense perceptions are telling me about. Now, all of our modern relativism and all of our weird abstract philosophy that doesn't apply to real life is based on denying the possibility of what the Stoics called comprehension. Because how do we know, right? How do we know that our sense perceptions tell us about the world outside and not just about our own kind of neurons firing that generate this illusion, right? There is nothing, as Hamlet says when he's mad, there's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. It's all just in our heads. And some Darwinists, some Freudians will kind of make arguments like this, that things like love, especially, which are not actually, directly perceived by the senses. These are just kind of like brain farts, basically. The Stoics say, no, there are certain fantasiae, and that sounds like the word fantasy, but it's only distantly related. What it means is like there are certain sense experiences, like that black circle, which have a certain quality. They are kataleptike, and that is they are properly they're properly comprehension stimulating experiences. So my experience of this camera in front of me has a quality to it that my dreams don't have. When I dream, my sort of like the images in my head are of a different quality, and I would not be right to give a sense to them. So if I had a dream that I could fly, I would not then wake up and like jump off a building. Why? Because that experience, that sort of set of perceptions that I had, was not kataleptike. It was not of the quality that makes me say, ah, yes, this is true, this is real. And the Stoics believe, and I believe, that you can tell the difference, that you can actually tell the difference between like when you're a man dreaming you're a butterfly, right? Versus when you are an actual man in the world seeing things, and like I know that that camera is there, and I even if I sort of like make some fancy argument that it's not there, I'm still going to behave like it is. I'm not going to behave as if like I can't be sure whether the camera is there. That would immobilize me. And so this is again, this is this kind of sensible way of handling the experiences that we have and trying to discern in them what is true and real, which is something that is sorely lacking, right, in kind of modern philosophy, in modern ways of dealing with the world. So that in itself is wholly salutary. Then the hand, once you've closed your hand in catalepsis, in comprehension, then you take your other hand, and this is episteme, which is knowledge or theoretical knowledge. And that's, once I have understood not only the things that I'm seeing, but that I am seeing them and how I'm seeing them, and all the sciences, all of the mathematical theories and philosophy itself is a kind of self-aware understanding. I don't just know this particular fact, but I know a whole sort of structure into which that set of facts is integrated. All of this as a way of getting at how can we know what's true? This is the Greek word that comes up here is kriterion, which is where we get our word criterion. It's what's the baseline? What's the first thing where it's like this is where our rudiments of truth come from. For the Stoics, it's this sort of act of seeing the world and grasping it in the correct way and learning to throw out things that are false and incorrect ideas that we have, like dreams or when we go mad and so forth. Now this stuff, this sort of anti-relativist stuff, this goes right back to the very beginning of that philosophical story I was telling. Because remember that Socrates was grappling with people like Heraclitus, who argued that everything is in flux, right? Because everything changes, right? We get old, nothing stays the same in the world that we see around us. So how can we know that, what's good today will be good tomorrow, and what's evil today will be evil tomorrow? And so Socrates, from the very beginning, was sort of looking for something stable and eternal that we could ground things in some way that we could know that our perceptions of certain things are true, and how we know that. And so right up through Plato, and then now into this kind of post Alexander, this Hellenistic fragmentation. We have this kind of like searching to know what is true, and then the next step, right? If you have that in place, is to talk about how you communicate, right? How do I take my sense perception and tell you about it? And this is where you get this kind of tripartite theory of language. This is something that I really love. It's in Sextus Empiricus, who's this skeptic who records a lot of stuff about other philosophies. He has it's called adversus mathematicos, against the scientists or the mathematicians. This is again in the 2nd or 3rd century AD, so way after Diogenes and those guys, right? There are 3 things that happen when we speak. One is called the hyparchon, and that's like the thing that is out there, the camera, for example, that I'm looking at, or the table that I see in front of me. That's the thing that exists. Then I have that sense perception that I was talking about, right? And when I have that sense perception, my idea about it kind of comes to be in my mind, and that is sometimes called the lecton, the sayable, the thing that I can communicate to you is that idea. And then finally I have like the word itself, camera, right? The actual sound of it, which I say, and that prompts that same idea in you. So we have the possibility now of actually like talking to each other and doing philosophy and making podcasts and all this other stuff. Why does this matter? Why is it important? Well, it brings up this whole thing of like ideas, right? What's an idea? It's not something you can perceive with your senses. It comes out of sense perception a lot of the time. But my idea of a camera is not actually a physical thing, even if it takes place according to certain neurological firings, right? Even if my brain behaves in certain ways when I have the idea is not the same thing as my brain or as my neurons. And so this brings us actually into physics, right? Into what is what exists, what's in the world, right? So physics in the biggest possible sense. Remember, it comes from a Greek word physis, meaning nature. What are the things that sort of happen spontaneously or generate their own change and motion? And what are the laws of how that world works, and what is there in it? Now, here's where Stoicism becomes both sort of mystical and also just adjacent to Christianity. Like, it has this weird quality, and I've talked about before John 1, the first chapter of the Gospel of John has these ideas that seem to be kind of interacting with Stoicism. I'm going to talk a lot more about how Christianity interacts with Stoicism in a later episode. But let's just sort of talk about the basic Stoic idea about what the universe is, right? They are sometimes called materialists, which is not quite right. A materialist is somebody who believes there is nothing except for stuff, except for the matter. The Greeks called it hule, which is like a metaphor from wood, right? The material that you build stuff out of. But I've just said, right, that the Stoics believe there are ideas you can communicate in language as well. And they use this weird kind of trick. They say, like, all things that can act or be acted upon are bodies, physical bodies. But and everything is a body. Everything that exists in like a stable way is a body, including things like breath, and we're going to get to like God as well, and spirit. These things are bodies because they act upon stuff. But there are also things that they subsist. So they sort of exist in a sense of we have these ideas and we can communicate them to each other, but they aren't actually the deepest ground of being. And all of the things that exist in the deepest reality are bodies. So this is a little trippy. I'm going to read now from a summary of it that's, again, in Diogenes. Body. So this is soma, the Greek, right? Body is that which extends in 3 dimensions: length, breadth, and depth. This is also called solid body. A surface is the limit of a body, or that which has only length and breadth but no depth. This, as Posidonius says, exists both conceptually and in reality. So that's a difference between that and the concept of like the sort of idea of a camera, right? The camera has extension in space. It's 3-dimensional, right? Now, God, intellect, fate, and Zeus are one thing, though called by many different names. In the beginning, then, being by himself, God turned all of substance through air into water. And just as the sperm is contained in the seminal fluid, so God, being the seminal principle of the universe, remains in the moist substance and adapts matter to himself for the generation of the things that are to come. He then generates the 4 elements: fire, water, air, and earth. An element is that from which generated things are first generated and into which they are finally resolved. The 4 elements together constitute unqualified substance, that is matter. This is the hule. This is like if you imagine, matter on its own without God, even though the Stoics don't believe any such thing really ever exists, right? It would just be this gunk, just this kind of like undifferentiated stuff. And God, who is again physically extended throughout the whole universe, God's reason, his intellect, which is the same as himself, right? He is the logos, is the Greek word. This rationality, this rational force, brings order to everything. Now, when I say this stuff is trippy, what I mean is that when you start talking in ancient terms about it, it starts to sound like mumbo jumbo. But back when we did the Timaeus, which is Plato's dialogue kind of about some of this stuff, I argued that if you translate this into modern terms, it's actually not mumbo jumbo at all. It's like basically how we still talk about this stuff. Think about when we study math, right? What we say about math is that it is this sort of reason that undergirds the whole universe. It's this order that if we understand the order, we can understand not only where the planets are going to go, but also what's going to happen if I drop my coffee cup on the floor, right? These rules of number, as Pythagoras would have called them, right? These rules of number inhere in everything. And the Stoics basically believe that is God, that God is this mind, this set of ideas that just permeates the whole universe and is what you would call coterminous or coextensive with it. So you have matter and you have God, and God is constantly acting and matter is constantly being acted upon, which means that everything is sort of suffused with reason. And that is why my perceptions tell me something true. That's why when I see a black circle and I divine from this that there's a camera, right? There's a certain kind of inherent rationality in those perceptions, and I can recognize that rationality and say, yeah, that this thing that I'm seeing, this world that I'm seeing, does exist. It is ordered in the way that I perceive it because God himself pervades the whole universe. Now, you can see probably how close to Christianity this is. It's monotheist, and that's a little bit controversial in the ancient world, right? So philosophers are always these kind of kooky characters, and that's part of why I sort of introduced you to Zeno at the beginning, the founder of this school, right? They're always these kooky characters. Socrates was so out of the norm that he basically had to be removed from society, and this is one way in which the Stoics pressed up against the traditional Greek view of multiple gods, and that made them kind of weirdly attractive, even if they were ultimately pagans, right, to the Christians. And this idea that God permeates and animates the whole of the universe, that is also an idea that's quite compatible with Jewish theology and then ultimately with the Christian theology that emerges out of Judaism. But, right, the idea that matter and God are kind of in this eternal coterminous dance, right? That there is nothing beyond this material world, but that there's only what's in it, right? That's the place where Christians and Stoics differ, and they differ in this really crucial way. So these very lofty and abstract speculations, right, I am now going to argue, play themselves out in the field of ethics in such a way that you can actually see them kind of diverging. You can see the Christian and the Stoic ideas of ethics and how we should live diverging, in part because of this difference, that either there is only the universe, that is matter and bodies acting upon each other, or there is a universe suffused with God, but that doesn't exhaust God, right? That has God beyond it, infinitely beyond it. And this is the Christian idea, right? So why does all of this come together in ethics? So right now we've got two ideas on the table, right? One from logic and one from physics. The logical idea is that the way I know things is by looking at my experiencing my perceptions and understanding what I can draw from them that is true, and rejecting anything that gives me a false impression. So, for example, dreams and madness, right? That's the idea from logic, from the bones of philosophy. Then I have this cosmological idea that the whole universe is just this giant, it's like one giant body with a spirit animating it, and the spirit is God. And that rational order of things pervades everything, and that's all there is. And actually the idea is basically that proceeds and then goes up to a certain point and then has a conflagration, ekpyrosis. It literally bursts into flame and starts all over again. So sort of like these loops, which some modern physicists also have this idea that we're kind of like, after the Big Bang, the universe expands and then it crunches back down and starts again. So there's a cyclical idea of this universe that is in eternity, that's all there is. Now we carry those two things into ethics, which is like, what do I do tomorrow? And this is where you get this famous Stoic idea of what is called Ataraxia. It's from a Greek word tarasso, meaning to disturb or perturb. And Ataraxia is to be undisturbed, unperturbed. It's perfectly serene. So to have that Stoic control over your emotions, right? The Stoics believe that what you must do, is grasp the wisdom which receives good things as genuinely good and bad things as genuinely bad, and regards with indifference things that don't actually harm you. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say, for example, that I'm lifting weights, right? And I feel pain. One reaction to that would be like, oh, this really hurts, and I should stop because it's bad. But that's a misapprehension, right? That's like taking the wrong information out of my physical perceptions. What I should say is, oh, actually, strength is good, and so this feeling of pain is a feeling of strength, and therefore I'm going to push stoically on, right, through my bench press or whatever. The whole Stoic system of ethics is basically based on this hyper-rational way of viewing the universe, that this system all makes sense, right? The whole thing, if you see it correctly, is pervaded by God, and what I do is determined by my accurate, sort of wise reaction to things as they really are. So here's a passage from Diogenes. So he's talking about indifference. That's things that we just, we neither should treat as good or bad. He says indifferent has two meanings. In one sense, it signifies the things that contribute neither to happiness nor unhappiness, like wealth, fame, health, strength, and the like. So for Stoics, you should be able to gain and lose those things without really being devastated. And so, by the way, when I said that like strength is a good, that was actually not a Stoic idea. That was an example of how I might react if I did believe strength is a good, right? But wealth, fame, health, strength, all these things are indifference. It is possible to be happy even without those things, though depending on how they are used, they contribute to happiness or unhappiness. But in another sense, indifferent signifies things that excite neither impulse nor aversion, as is the case with having an odd or even number of hairs on one's head, or with extending or bending one's finger. But it was not in this sense that the things mentioned above are called indifferent, since they are able to excite impulse and aversion. This is why some of the indifferent things are selected and others rejected, whereas indifference in the other sense provides no grounds for choosing or avoiding. So this is the puzzle that Stoic ethics tries to solve, right? That we have these reactions to things that aren't wholly rational, that aren't based on the reality of actual good and evil. And our ethics should be based on that ataraxia, on the inability to be perturbed by things that sort of shake us wrongly, that aren't actually bad. And so this is why, for example, if you find yourself condemned to death as a Stoic, and this is something that Boethius, a much later philosopher, deals with to some extent, right? You should be able to kind of be consoled by philosophy. You should be sort of rock solid in your determination. Now, the last and sort of most thorny thing that arises out of this, and this is where I'm going to say that there's actually a difference between Christianity and Stoicism, right, is that this is a determinist view of the world. That is, if the world is animated by a rational mind, right, by this rational mind that just says, this thing happens and this thing happens next, right, the whole thing is linked in this giant unbroken chain of causation, and there's nothing outside of that, right? Remember, God does not extend beyond the cosmos; He's just in the whole cosmos, right? So if there's nothing outside of cause and effect, then our own actions are themselves kind of looped into this giant web of just this happens and then this happens and this happens. Now, the Stoics don't really want to accept this. They don't want free will to be taken out of the world, because they want to be able to praise and blame things, say certain ways of behaving are good and certain ways are bad. And so they kind of try to square this circle, and we're sort of told by Cicero, for example, in On Fate, that they have this idea that what good and bad are is they are behaving in ways that are sort of antithetical to your nature if it's bad, or that go with your nature if it's good. So the metaphor that is used sometimes is like, so let's imagine that a cylinder gets pushed down a hill, right? The cylinder rolls. But why does it roll? Well, because its nature is to roll, right? It's round. It's a certain kind of thing that behaves in a certain kind of way. And for humans, because we are rational beings, you can kind of like praise and blame people for behaving in certain ways, even if there's no version of the universe in which they behaved otherwise. Now, to me, this is a point at which things break down, because they have this kind of wrinkle, right, in their cosmology, which doesn't posit any God beyond the world, as in fact many modern cosmologies do not, right? And they're like the way that they want to behave, which is quite noble, right? Of course, it's very admirable and noble, and ultimately, I think my argument here against Stoicism as a total philosophy is simply that it doesn't quite make room for the whole reality of things. We know that we do have free choice, and not just the kind of free choice that boils down to our natures, like being cylinders rolling down a hill, right? We can act differently, and when we praise and blame people, we do so because we know that they had a choice, right? And weirdly, ironically, perhaps, we discover that the ability to say that depends on something outside of just the kind of physical chain of causation in the world, right? Even if we agree with Stoics that the whole world is permeated by a divine mind, by some kind of order that's knowable through mathematics or through science or what have you, right? We either have to say that's it and then give up on ethics, on good and bad, Or we have to say, and then beyond that, there's this stuff that I keep talking about in this show, which expands beyond the limits of our perception and our philosophy, right? I keep paraphrasing Hamlet. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in your philosophy. And this is essentially this kind of divine madness that Christianity and other philosophies too, right? That some of the pagan Greeks would have agreed with me about this, right? That there is this kind of thing beyond just the pure rationality of things. And that gets us also, to a problem with Ataraxia as a philosophy. The thing is, it's not human, right? Ultimately, and every Stoic that we visit will eventually reprimand himself for not behaving according to Ataraxia. And in fact, Diogenes Laertes talks about one Stoic who basically gave up on Ataraxia because he had an eye disease. And he was like, I can't, this is obviously not possible. And all of this was just an empty abstraction about pain rather than people who had actually had pain. If you've actually experienced pain, deep pain, the kind of suffering that the world can really inflict on you, you know that there's something in us that is more than just a machine for calculating what is really good and what is really bad. And so to close out, I'm just going to read from perhaps a somewhat unexpected source, which is Chesterton. I talked about him recently when I was talking about localism, right? But this is Orthodoxy, which he publishes in 1908, and he kind of encapsulates what troubles me about Stoicism in the end. Right? He says, the last thing that can be said of a lunatic is that his actions are causeless. If any human acts may loosely be called causeless, they are the minor acts of a healthy man, whistling as he walks, slashing the grass with a stick, kicking his heels, or rubbing his hands. It is the happy man who does the useless things. The sick man is not strong enough to be idle. It is exactly such careless and causeless actions that the madman could never understand, for the madman, like the determinist, generally sees too much cause in everything. The madman would read a conspiratorial significance into those empty activities. He would think that the lopping of the grass was an attack on private property. He would think that the kicking of the heels was a signal to an accomplice. If the madman could for an instant become careless, he would become sane. Everyone who has had the misfortune to talk with people in the heart or on the edge of mental disorder knows that their most sinister quality is a horrible clarity of detail, a connecting of one thing with another in a map more elaborate than a maze. If you argue with a madman, it is extremely probable that you will get the worst of it, for in many ways his mind moves all the quicker for not being delayed by the things that go with good judgment. He is not hampered by a sense of humor or by charity or by the dumb certainties of experience. He is the more logical for losing certain sane affections. Indeed, the common phrase for insanity is in this respect a misleading one. The madman is not the man who has lost his reason. The madman is the man who has lost everything except his reason. So you see what I'm getting at? It's not that the Stoic philosophers whom we've encountered are reprehensible people. Far from it. In fact, Zeno of Citium was hugely well regarded in Athens and by all accounts seems to have been an affable sort of fellow. Marcus Aurelius, whom we'll discuss a couple episodes from now, is one of the most admirable characters of ancient history. But if they were good Stoics, that is, if they really achieved the wisdom that Stoicism aspires to, you wouldn't really want to know them. They would have been deprived of some humanity, this kind of squishiness, a certain form of irrationality, and a belief in the variability of life and the messiness of life. But it wasn't their Stoicism that held them back, right? Their Stoicism would have pushed them to the fullest extent of just all things in rational order and all emotions rationally governed. Now, of course, one of the reasons why we're interested in Stoicism now is that we could use a lot more rational government of our emotions, and the manly quality of Stoic ethics and the way that it encourages us to gain control of ourselves is totally salutary. It's certainly a step in the right direction from where most of us are right now, I think. But if it's taken to its full extreme because of that weird sort of cosmological glitch, that they don't posit God even anywhere beyond the cosmos, because of that, it loses a certain reality, a certain humanity, which comes from believing that there's an infinity of mystery out beyond the world that we live in. And so to close, just one more passage from this time from C.S. Lewis. This is his book on miracles, 1947. So Lewis is here arguing that the structure of reason itself suggests that it has its roots in something beyond the physical world and beyond the natural world. He says, if any thought is valid, then a reason must exist and must be the source of my own imperfect and intermittent rationality. Human minds are not the only supernatural entities that exist. They do not come from nowhere. Each has come into nature from supernature. Each has its taproot in an eternal, self-existent, rational being whom we call God. Each, that is, each human mind, is an offshoot or spearhead or incursion of that supernatural reality into nature. I have dwelled on this point to stress that this whole fabric of philosophy, the Stoic fabric, the Christian fabric, the Epicurean fabric that we'll talk about next week, these things are interconnected, and the realism of connecting them and the accountability to reality is what we most, I think, need to reclaim from Stoicism. In addition to some of the composure, the containment, right? In general, of course, it is a good thing to be able to react sanely to things and according to their actual goodness. But we need to preserve some space for something beyond the world that we can calculate and understand physically. And so, that weird wrinkle in one area of Stoicism kind of has all these knock-on effects in other areas of the philosophy, which is really the main thing that I want to draw from this first episode, right? Philosophy is a seamless garment. It has to do with not just what you believe about the heavens, but what you believe about earth. And those two things can't be separated from one another. So if you are pondering these things right now, and if you are wondering just like, how do I live in the morning? Well, start right, with what you believe about what is good and evil, and see if that squares up with the kind of theories that you have about the grand designs of heaven. If it does, then move forward and act accordingly, right? If it doesn't, then find where this sort of glitch or error is in your mind, and it could be somewhere totally unexpected because reality, right, is a seamless garment, and so philosophy, which describes reality, should be too. This is our survey of Greek Stoicism. We will move on now to Epicureanism, but then come back again to Stoicism when we talk about its influence on Rome much later than these sort of early Hellenistic Greek philosophers like Chrysippus and Zeno of Citium. Before I go, I just want to say one more time to remind you that you can go to youngheretics.com/locals and find a whole new way of connecting with the show. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you I hope you get something out of it. And if you do, then you can really help support us as well as getting all this new stuff. Remember, exclusive articles from me, live Q&As, all this stuff, right? And support us and keep us out of the reach of big tech by going to youngheretics.com/locals. Okay. One mailbag question, and this is a good example, right? I usually kind of pick mailbag questions up from Twitter, but you can send me mailbag questions through Locals and get sort of exclusive access if you go over there. But here's a couple mailbag questions that come one after the other. One is from Lauren at Lauren Seth C, and another is from Arlie Coles at Arlie Coles. What is the one classic that you just can't get through or get into despite numerous attempts? And then Arlie adds on in a similar vein, lit that you appreciate but do not enjoy. Well, this is a really good question because it hits upon a delicate issue of taste, right? This is a show that unapologetically, we believe here that there are certain great works and that they're evidently great. And that actually even transcends things that I like and don't like. I believe that any great work, if you spend enough time with it, will give you things, will teach you rich lessons, and will sort of change the way you see the world. But look, people have different preferences, and those aren't written in stone. Those aren't like part of the whole fabric of the universe. They have something to do with just your own unique essence as a divinely created being. My own view on this is that you can actually discern, in the same way when I was talking about Stoicism, that you can discern ways in which certain perceptions and experiences feel real and others feel unreal, right? You can discern a richness in the quality of a literary work, which goes beyond whether you're kind of bored reading it or whether it like is your favorite thing ever that you just want to return to all the time. And that's one thing that I kind of encourage people when they're saying I'm having a hard time getting into Homer or whatever. I encourage people to like just slog through, because you'll learn to sort of recognize that richness. You may ultimately come to love it. You may not, and so anyway, this is a long way of getting around to the answer to the question, which is Moby Dick is the book that I can tell is a masterwork. And I have read it. It's not like I stopped reading halfway through or anything, but I find a lot of this stuff about whales kind of boring. And again, you never say never on this stuff. I may come back to it and really enjoy it. It's just not quite my style. That Melville's style is a little bit sort of ornate for me in a weird way. There are certain ornate writers that I love, but for me, Melville is like just feels a little bit affected. Nevertheless, it obviously contains like many profound, distinctively American reflections on the infinitude of the sea and what it has meant and what it means to us who are inherently kind of voyaging people. Anyway, Moby Dick, not a big fan. This has been another episode of Young Heretics. Thank you so much for joining me. And do please give us a 5-star review on iTunes. That really helps the show. And so does signing up for locals. One more time, that's youngheretics.com/locals. If you like this show, you'll love the work that we do at the Claremont Institute, which that's my employers. We publish the Claremont Review of Books, which is a print magazine, and then The American Mind, which is online. You'll love them both. And if you'd like to support us, go to claremont.org/donate. Thanks again for listening. I'm Spencer Klavan. This is Young Heretics, and I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.